The gunshot echoed through the vast Wyoming prairie as Grace Morgan clutched her infant daughter tighter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her husband Jeremiah had just fired into the air, his ultimatum hanging between them like a death sentence. "It's me or that useless girl child. Choose now, woman." Wyoming Territory, 1875. The land was as unforgiving as the men who claimed it, and Grace Morgan had discovered this truth in the cruelest way possible. Shivering in the autumn chill, she watched her husband of 3 years mount his horse and ride away from their modest homestead, taking their only wagon, their meager savings, and every last shred of the life they'd built together. A son, he had demanded for months during her pregnancy. "Give me a son to carry on my name." When the midwife had placed little Sarah in his arms instead, something in Jeremiah's eyes had gone cold and distant. For 2 weeks, he had barely acknowledged either of them, until this morning when he'd packed his belongings and delivered his cruel choice. Night was falling fast across the rolling plains, and Grace knew she and her daughter wouldn't survive the coming winter alone in their isolated cabin. The nearest town, Pine Ridge, was 15 miles away, too far to walk with a newborn and no supplies. As the last light faded from the sky, Grace heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Fear gripped her heart. Had Jeremiah returned to finish what he'd started? She clutched Sarah closer, her free hand moving toward the small kitchen knife she'd tucked into her apron pocket, the only protection she had left. A tall silhouette appeared against the darkening horizon. Not Jeremiah's slight frame, but a broader, more imposing figure atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size, and Grace caught the glint of a sheriff's badge as he approached. "Madam, everything all right out here?" heard a shot from the trail. His voice was deep but gentle, with a hint of concern that Grace hadn't heard directed at her in months. We're fine," she managed, though her voice cracked with the obvious lie. The baby started to fuss against her chest. The stranger stepped closer, and in the fading light, Grace could make out his features. Strong jaw covered with a neatly trimmed beard, kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and a mouth that seemed more accustomed to smiling than frowning. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair with strands of silver at the temples. "Lucas Reid, sheriff of Pine Ridge," he introduced himself, his eyes taking in the scene: Grace's tear-stained face, the empty stable where their work horse and wagon should have been, the single trunk of her belongings sitting forlornly by the door. "Looks to me like everything's not fine at all." Grace felt the last of her composure crumbling. "My husband, he's gone, left us because—" She looked down at Sarah, unable to finish the shameful sentence. Sheriff Reed's expression darkened as understanding dawned. He'd seen this before: men abandoning wives who bore daughters instead of sons, leaving them to certain death on the frontier without protection or provisions. "Night's coming on fast, and so is winter," he said, looking toward the darkening horizon where storm clouds were gathering. His decision was made in an instant, born from both duty and something deeper he couldn't name. "You're coming home with me," the cowboy said, rescuing the widow abandoned for bearing a daughter. "Both of you." Grace stared at him, disbelief warring with desperate hope. "Sir, I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Lucas said firmly, though his eyes remained kind. "I've got a sister in town with a spare room. We'll get you situated proper-like until you decide what's next." He gestured to the trunk. "That all you've got?" Grace nodded mutely, too overwhelmed to speak. Within minutes, Sheriff Reed had secured her trunk to his horse, fashioned a makeshift sling for baby Sarah from Grace's shawl, and helped them both onto his stallion. As they rode away from the cabin that had briefly been her home, Grace felt a strange mixture of grief and relief wash over her. Behind them, the first snowflakes began to fall, covering the tracks of their departure. The journey to Pine Ridge was largely silent, broken only by Sarah's occasional whimpers and the sheriff's quiet reassurances. The rhythm of the horse beneath them and the solid warmth of Lucas Reed's back against her chest lulled Grace into an exhausted daze. She had barely slept since Sarah's birth, constantly trying to appease Jeremiah's growing resentment. "Almost there," Lucas called over his shoulder as the lights of Pine Ridge came into view. The small frontier town was modest but thriving, with a main street lined by a general store, saloon, church, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. Lucas guided his horse directly to a tidy two-story house on the edge of town. Light glowed warmly from the windows and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. Before they had even dismounted, the front door flew open, and a woman who shared the sheriff's strong features but with softer edges hurried down the path. "Lucas, what on earth? Who's this you've brought?" Her curious eyes took in Grace and the baby. "Lillian, this is Mrs. Morgan and her daughter. They need a place to stay. Her husband abandoned them out at the old Peterson claim." The look that passed between brother and sister conveyed volumes more than his words. Lillian's expression immediately softened. "Well, you poor dear, come inside this instant before you both catch your death." The next hours passed in a blur for Grace. Lillian Reed, a widow herself with no children, proved to be a whirlwind of efficiency and kindness. She fed Grace a hearty stew, helped her bathe Sarah, and prepared a comfortable bedroom with a small cradle that she explained had belonged to a neighbor's child who had long since outgrown it. "I've kept it in the attic, thinking someone might need it someday," Lillian explained as she placed fresh linens in the cradle. "Seems like Providence now." When Grace was finally alone with Sarah, both clean and fed for the first time in what felt like ages, the tears came again. Not tears of despair this time, but of relief and gratitude. As she drifted off to sleep with her daughter safely beside her, Grace wondered what tomorrow would bring in this unexpected sanctuary. Morning came with the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up the stairs. Grace changed and fed Sarah, then made her way down to the kitchen where Lillian was busy at the stove. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Reed in the yard, chopping wood with powerful, rhythmic strokes. "Good morning, dear," Lillian greeted her cheerfully. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Grace admitted. "Mrs. Reed, I don't know how to thank you." "Lillian, please. And there's no need for thanks. Decent folk help each other out here. It's the only way to survive." She placed a plate of eggs and bacon before Grace. "Eat up now. You need your strength, especially if you're nursing." Grace ate gratefully, realizing how hungry she truly was. As she finished, Lucas came in, stamping snow from his boots and bringing a rush of cold air with him. "Morning, Mrs. Morgan," he nodded, his eyes warm as they met hers briefly before moving to the baby in her arms. "And good morning to you too, little miss." "Please call me Grace," she said softly. "And this is Sarah." Lucas smiled, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Sarah, that's a fine name." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Lucas would leave early for his duties as sheriff. Lillian would tend to her small millinery business in a front room of the house, and Grace would help with household chores while caring for Sarah. In the evenings, they would gather around the fire, and Lucas would often read from one of his beloved books stories of adventure and far-off places that made Grace momentarily forget her troubles. A week turned into two, and Grace began to notice things about Lucas Reed that stirred feelings she thought had died with Jeremiah's betrayal. The gentle way he always asked permission before holding Sarah. How he listened intently when Grace spoke, as if her words truly mattered. The respect he showed to everyone in town, from the banker to the stable boy. Most of all, the way he never once made her feel like a burden, despite having rescued her from certain death. On a crisp morning in late November, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when Lucas approached, his expression unusually serious. "Got word this morning," he said without preamble. "Your husband's been seen in Cheyenne. Seems he's claiming you died in childbirth." Grace's hands trembled on the damp sheet she was hanging. "So he's not coming back?" "No, he's not." Lucas studied her face carefully. "Does that trouble you?" Grace considered the question, searching her heart for any remnant of love for Jeremiah. She found none. "No," she said finally. "What troubles me is what happens now. I can't impose on you and Lillian forever." Lucas shifted his weight, suddenly looking less like the confident sheriff and more like a nervous schoolboy. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. Lillian's shop is doing well, but she could use help. She mentioned you're skilled with a needle." "I used to make all my own clothes," Grace confirmed, "and Jeremiah's too." "Well then," Lucas said, looking relieved, "there's your answer. You can work with Lillian, earn your keep right here. That is, if you want to stay." The offer hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. "And you, Sheriff Reed, would you want us to stay?" Grace surprised herself with her boldness. Lucas's eyes held her steadily. "More than I probably should admit, Mrs. Morgan, more than I probably should." The winter of 1875 proved to be one of the harshest in Wyoming Territory's memory. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and temperatures dropped so low that the creek running through Pine Ridge froze, solid enough to drive wagons across. Inside the Reed home, however, warmth prevailed not just from the constantly tended fires but from the growing bonds between its inhabitants. Grace's skill with needle and thread quickly proved invaluable to Lillian's millinery business. She had an eye for embellishment that transformed ordinary hats into coveted treasures, drawing customers from as far as Cheyenne when weather permitted travel. For the first time, Grace felt the satisfaction of earning her own money, tucking away a small portion of her wages in a tin box beneath her bed security for Sarah's future. Sarah thrived in the loving household. At 4 months old, she was a cheerful baby with Lucas's dimple. When she smiled, a coincidence that Lillian often remarked upon with a knowing look that made Grace blush. The infant had bewitched both Reeds entirely, but none more than Lucas himself. "Never thought I'd be so taken with such a tiny thing," he confessed one evening as he rocked Sarah to sleep while Grace mended a tear in one of his shirts. "My sister says I'm making a fool of myself." "Your sister is just jealous that Sarah prefers your singing to hers," Grace teased, enjoying the flush that crept up his neck. These quiet evenings became precious to Grace. After Sarah was tucked into her cradle and Lillian retired to her room, Grace and Lucas would often linger by the fire, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Missouri, coming west after the war, finding purpose in bringing law to lawless places. She shared memories of her childhood in Pennsylvania. Her dreams of becoming a teacher before her parents' deaths had left her with few options but to marry the first man who offered. "Jeremiah seemed kind at first," she admitted one night, staring into the flames. "He promised me a good life out west, said we'd build something together," her voice caught. "I believed him." Lucas's hand found hers in the space between their chairs, his calloused fingers curling gently around her smaller ones. "Some men don't deserve the women they win," he said softly. "And some women are stronger than they ever knew they could be." His touch sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Grace knew she should pull away. She was still legally married, after all, but she couldn't bring herself to break that tenuous connection. As winter gave way to spring, Grace found herself watching Lucas when he didn't notice. The way the sunlight caught in his dark hair when he removed his hat, the strength in his hands as he repaired a broken fence post, the patience in his voice as he explained local laws to newcomers. She tried to tell herself it was just gratitude she felt, just the natural appreciation of a woman rescued from dire circumstances. But in her heart, she knew it was more. Late one April afternoon, as the first wildflowers began dotting the prairie, Lucas returned home with a grim expression that instantly set Grace on edge. "What's happened?" she asked, meeting him at the door. "Jeremiah Morgan was killed in a saloon fight in Laramie last week," he said without preamble, watching her face carefully. "Just got the telegram from the marshal there." Grace sank into a kitchen chair, Sarah balanced on her hip. A whirlwind of emotions swept through her: shock, confusion, and something that felt shamefully like relief. "How?" she managed to ask. "Accused another man of cheating at cards, drew on him. Other fellow was faster." Lucas sat across from her. "I'm sorry, Grace." She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not sure what I'm feeling. Is that terrible of me? He was my husband, and yet he left you and this little one to die," Lucas finished for her, his voice gentle but firm. "There's no shame in your feelings, whatever they might be." Grace nodded, grateful for his understanding. As the news settled over her, one thought became increasingly clear: she was now truly a widow, free from the bonds of a marriage that had brought her nothing but pain in the end. That night, after Sarah was asleep, Grace slipped outside to the small porch. The spring air was cool but not cold, scented with the promise of renewal. Lucas joined her a few minutes later, offering a shawl which he draped carefully around her shoulders. "Thought you might need this," he said, his hands lingering briefly before he stepped back to a respectable distance. "Thank you." Grace pulled the shawl tighter, more for comfort than warmth. "Lucas, I've been thinking about what happens now." He leaned against the porch rail, his profile strong against the starlit sky. "And what have you decided?" "Nothing yet. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you and Lillian have done, taking us in, giving us a home, a purpose." She paused, gathering courage. "But I need to find my own way forward. For Sarah's sake." Lucas was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I understand. You're a proud woman, Grace Morgan. It's one of the things I admire most about you." His words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Grace's heart quickened. "There are other options, you know," he continued, his voice low and carefully measured. "Options that wouldn't take you away from here." "What options might those be?" Grace asked, scarcely daring to breathe. Lucas turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his expression was earnest, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I'm not a wealthy man, Grace. I've got this house that was our parents', my position as sheriff, and some savings. It's not much to offer, but—" He took a deep breath. "I care for you. And I love that little girl like she was my own. If you needed time, I'd understand. But if you'd consider making this arrangement permanent, making us a family in truth, I'd count myself the luckiest man in the territory." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. "Are you asking me to marry you, Sheriff Reed?" "I reckon I am," he said, a smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the moment. "Doing a poor job of it, too." "No," Grace whispered, stepping closer to him. "I think you're doing just fine." The church in Pine Ridge was filled to capacity on a bright June morning as Grace Morgan became Grace Reed. The entire town had turned out for the wedding, partly out of affection for their sheriff, and partly from curiosity about the young widow who had captured his heart. Gossip had run rampant, of course speculation about the timing, whispers about propriety, but faced with the obvious devotion between the couple, even the most stalwart critics had eventually softened. Lillian had outdone herself creating Grace's wedding ensemble, a simple but elegant pale blue dress that complemented her fair coloring, and a matching bonnet adorned with silk ribbons and tiny white flowers. Sarah, now 7 months old and recently taking her first tentative steps while holding onto furniture, wore a miniature version of her mother's outfit and cooed happily in Lillian's arms at the front of the church. When Lucas saw Grace walking toward him down the aisle, the naked adoration in his eyes brought tears to her own. This was nothing like her first wedding, a hasty, practical affair with a man she barely knew. This time, she was choosing a partner whose character she had witnessed daily, whose kindness had healed her broken spirit, whose strength had given her the safety to find her own. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. When Lucas placed the simple gold band on Grace's finger, purchased with the money he'd been saving for a new horse, his hands trembled slightly, betraying the depth of his emotion. As they spoke their vows, Sarah let out a delighted squeal that broke the solemnity and caused ripples of laughter through the congregation. "I think she approves," Lucas whispered, his dimple appearing as he smiled down at Grace. The celebration afterward spilled from the churchyard into the town square. Tables groaned with food contributed by every household in Pine Ridge: roast beef and fried chicken, potato salad and corn bread, pies of every description. A local fiddler struck up lively tunes, and soon couples were dancing on the packed earth of the street. As the festivities continued into the evening, Lucas drew Grace away from the crowd, leading her to a quiet spot behind the church where a bench sat beneath an old cottonwood tree. "Happy, Mrs. Reid?" he asked, his arm warm around her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Grace answered truthfully, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I never expected to find this again, to find home." Lucas pressed a kiss to her temple. "I've been waiting to give you something." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This came through yesterday." Grace opened the paper, reading the formal legal language with growing amazement. "This is adoption papers," Lucas finished for her. "If you agree, Sarah will legally be my daughter in every way that matters. I know she'll never remember a time when I wasn't her father, but I wanted to make it official." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as the full impact of his gesture hit her. In a society where men rarely chose to claim another man's child, especially a daughter, Lucas was not only accepting Sarah, but eagerly claiming her as his own. "There's nothing I would want more," Grace managed through her tears, turning in his arms to kiss him properly for the first time since the minister had pronounced them husband and wife. Later that night, after Lillian had tactfully announced she would be staying with a friend for a few days, Lucas carried Sarah up to the nursery they had prepared adjacent to the main bedroom. Together, they tucked her in, watching as she drifted off to sleep, clutching the small wooden horse Lucas had carved for her. In the privacy of their bedroom, initial shyness gave way to tender exploration. Lucas proved to be as gentle and considerate a lover as he was a man, attentive to Grace's comfort and pleasure in ways that made her previous marital experiences seem like pale shadows. When they finally lay entwined in the aftermath, Grace's head resting on his chest and his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, she felt a contentment so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Lucas asked, concern immediately replacing satisfaction in his voice. "Did I hurt you?" "No," Grace assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest directly over his heart. "Just the opposite. I never knew it could be like this, that I could feel so cherished." Lucas's arms tightened around her. "You are cherished, Grace Reid. You and Sarah both." I'll spend every day of my life making sure you never doubt it." As summer progressed into fall, the Reed household settled into new rhythms. Lillian, who had initially worried about being the odd one out after the marriage, found herself more integrated than ever as Aunt Lillian to Sarah, and trusted confidante to Grace. The millinery business thrived with both women working together, and they expanded their offerings to include fine dressmaking after several of Grace's creations drew admiration. Lucas continued his duties as sheriff, though he now made a point of taking meals at home whenever possible and rarely worked past sundown unless an emergency demanded it. On his rounds through town, he often carried Sarah on his shoulders, her delighted giggles drawing smiles from even the most taciturn townsfolk. Life wasn't without its challenges. Lucas's position sometimes put him in danger, as when a band of cattle rustlers passed through the area in late August, leading to a tense standoff that left him with a bullet graze along his ribs. Grace spent that night at his bedside, alternating between prayers of gratitude that the wound wasn't worse and fierce promises that she'd never let him out of her sight again, if he survived threats that made him chuckle despite the pain. "Takes more than a scratch to keep me from coming home to my girls," he assured her, though his pallor and the doctor's serious expression told a different story about how close the call had truly been. As autumn painted the surrounding hills in golds and reds, Grace began to suspect that their family might soon be growing. Her monthly courses, regular as clockwork since Sarah's birth, had failed to appear. At first, she kept the suspicion to herself, unwilling to raise hopes until she was certain. But as the symptoms mounted, the telltale nausea in the mornings, the tenderness in her breasts, the inexplicable tears that came at the slightest provocation, she knew she couldn't keep her secret much longer. She chose a Sunday afternoon in October to tell Lucas. Sarah was napping. Lillian had gone to visit a friend and they had the house to themselves. Grace found Lucas in his small study, where he was reviewing wanted posters sent from territorial authorities. "Have a minute?" she asked, lingering in the doorway. Lucas immediately set aside his work. "For you, always." He patted his knee in invitation and Grace settled onto his lap, his arms automatically encircling her waist. "I have some news," she began, suddenly nervous despite her certainty that Lucas would be pleased, his brow furrowed slightly. "Everything all right?" Grace took his hand and placed it low on her still flat abdomen. "Everything is wonderful. We're going to have a baby." Lucas went completely still for a heartbeat, then his face transformed with such joy that Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. "A baby?" he repeated, his voice hushed with wonder. "You're sure?" Grace nodded. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. He thinks sometime in late April." Lucas pulled her close, burying his face against her neck. When he finally looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A wife, children, a family of my own. After the war, I figured some things weren't meant for me." "And now?" Grace asked, cupping his bearded cheek in her palm. "Now I thank God every day for bringing you and Sarah to me," he said simply. "And I'll thank him double for this little one." Winter arrived early that year, bringing blizzards that isolated Pine Ridge for weeks at a time. The Reed home became a haven of warmth and contentment while storms raged outside. Sarah, now walking confidently and beginning to form words, delighted in helping Lillian bake cookies and listening to Lucas read stories by the fire. Grace's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her growing belly a source of fascination to her daughter, who would pat it gently and say "baby" with solemn importance. Christmas was a joyous affair, with Lucas outdoing himself in finding perfect gifts for his family. For Sarah, he commissioned a dollhouse from the town carpenter, detailed to look exactly like their own home. For Lillian, he tracked down a rare book of poetry she had mentioned once in passing. And for Grace, he presented a locket containing miniature portraits of himself and Sarah, with space left for the new baby. "So you'll always have us close to your heart," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Grace's gift to him was more practical, but no less meaningful, a fine leather-bound ledger for his sheriff's office, replacing the tattered one he'd been using for years, with their family's names inscribed on the inside cover. "To remind you what you're protecting out there," she said softly as he ran his fingers over the tooled leather. As winter slowly yielded to spring, Grace's time grew near. Unlike her pregnancy with Sarah, which had been marked by Jeremiah's increasing coldness and criticism, this experience was surrounded by care and anticipation. Lucas insisted on taking over her more strenuous chores. Lillian prepared the nursery with lovingly stitched blankets and curtains, and the women of Pine Ridge organized a baby shower that yielded enough handmade gifts to outfit 3 infants. On a mild April evening, just as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Grace's labor began. This time, instead of facing the ordeal alone with only a harried midwife for company, she was surrounded by support. Lillian managed the household and cared for Sarah, while Lucas, after being firmly banished from the birthing room by the no-nonsense midwife, paced the hallway like a caged mountain lion, appearing at the door every few minutes to ask for updates. The labor was shorter than with Sarah, but no less intense. When the final pains came, Grace found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, driven by the knowledge of the loving family waiting to welcome this child. "One more push, Mrs. Reed," the midwife encouraged. "That's it." And here we are. The lusty cry that filled the room moments later was the sweetest sound Grace had ever heard. She collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant, as the midwife efficiently cleaned and swaddled the newborn. "You have a fine, healthy son, Mrs. Reed," the woman announced, placing the tiny bundle in Grace's arms. A son. For an instant, Grace thought of Jeremiah, how he had abandoned them because Sarah wasn't the boy he'd demanded. The irony might have been bitter, except that Grace knew with absolute certainty that Lucas would have been just as overjoyed with another daughter. Gender meant nothing to him compared to the miracle of their child's safe arrival. "Let the poor man in before he wears a hole in your floorboards," the midwife chuckled, moving to open the bedroom door. Lucas entered cautiously, his face drawn with worry until he saw Grace's radiant smile. He crossed to the bed in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside her to gaze in awe at the small face nestled against her breast. "We have a son," Grace whispered, shifting the bundle so Lucas could see him better. "A son," Lucas repeated, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out a tentative finger to stroke the baby's cheek. "He's perfect. You're perfect. I love you both so much. Would you like to hold him?" The look of terrified delight on Lucas's face, as he carefully took his son into his arms for the first time, was something Grace knew she would remember until her dying day. This strong man, capable of facing down armed criminals without flinching, cradled the tiny infant as if he were made of the finest porcelain. "Hello, little man," he murmured. "I'm your pa." The simple declaration brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. This was what a father should be: proud, protective, present. Sarah had already claimed Lucas as Papa in her childish speech, never knowing the man who had rejected her. This boy would grow up with the same unwavering love and support. "What shall we name him?" Grace asked, though they had discussed possibilities for months. Lucas looked thoughtful. "I still favor your father's name if you're agreeable." "William Lucas Reed," Grace nodded. "It's perfect." When Lillian brought Sarah in to meet her new brother a short time later, the family circle felt complete. The toddler approached the bed cautiously, eyes wide with curiosity. "Baby," she asked, pointing at the bundle in Grace's arms. "Yes, sweetheart. This is your brother, William." Grace patted the bed beside her, and Lucas lifted Sarah up to sit next to her mother. Sarah peered at the sleeping infant, then looked up at Lucas with a puzzled expression. "Papa made." The adults exchanged amused glances at her innocent question. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, gathering his daughter close. "Yes, little one. Papa and Mama made your brother, just like they made you." It was a simple explanation that sidestepped complicated truths that could wait for when she was older. Sarah seemed satisfied with this answer. She leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on the baby's forehead, a gesture she had seen her parents perform countless times with her, then announced, "Sarah, love baby," before snuggling contentedly between the adults. The next few months were a whirlwind of adjustment as the family adapted to having a newborn in the house again. William proved to be a good-natured baby, with Lucas's dark hair and what Lillian insisted were Grace's eyes. Sarah took to her role as big sister with surprising enthusiasm, helping with diaper changes and proudly informing visitors that the baby was Sarah's brother. By midsummer, the Reed family had settled into new routines. On warm evenings, they often took supper on the back porch, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass beyond the garden while William dozed in his cradle, and Sarah chased the family's newly acquired puppy around the yard. On one such evening, as Grace and Lucas sat side by side on the porch swing after the children were in bed, Grace found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. "What are you thinking about so intently?" Lucas asked, noticing her pensive expression. "Just everything," Grace replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "2 years ago, I thought my life was over. When Jeremiah left us, I couldn't see any future for Sarah and me except hardship and struggle. And now—" She gestured to the house behind them, solid and warm with the sounds of their sleeping children. "Now I have all this, a real home, a family who loves us, purpose, joy." Lucas slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "I think about that day often," he admitted. "What if I hadn't heard that gunshot? What if I'd taken a different trail home, the thought of never finding you?" He shook his head. "I can't imagine my life without you and the children now." "You saved us," Grace said simply. "No," Lucas corrected her gently. "We saved each other. I was just going through the motions before you came along. Sheriff, brother, neighbor, I had roles, but not a life. Not really." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You gave me a reason for everything." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the porch swing creaking softly as they rocked. The stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, a canopy of light that had witnessed countless human stories unfold beneath it. "I have news," Grace said eventually, her voice quiet but filled with suppressed excitement. Lucas turned to look at her, eyebrows raised in question. "Mayor Thompson stopped by the shop today. The school board has approved my application. They want me to teach at the Pine Ridge School starting this fall." Lucas's face broke into a wide smile. "Grace, that's wonderful news. I know how much you've wanted this." Since William's birth, Grace had been studying in her spare time, working toward qualifying for a teaching position. The previous school teacher had left to get married, creating an unexpected opportunity that Grace had been determined to seize. "It's only 3 days a week, and I can bring William with me while he's still nursing. Lillian says she can manage the shop those days, and Mrs. Thompson has offered to watch Sarah along with her own children." Grace's words tumbled out in a rush of enthusiasm. "The salary isn't much, but it's something I'll have earned myself, doing work I've always dreamed of." "I couldn't be prouder," Lucas said, his voice warm with sincerity. "You'll be a wonderful teacher." They talked for a while longer about the practicalities books she would need, how to arrange the schoolroom, ideas for making learning engaging for the varied ages she would be teaching. Lucas listened attentively, offering suggestions and encouragement, never once suggesting that her ambition was inappropriate for a married woman with young children, as some men might have done. As the night grew cooler and they prepared to go inside, Lucas paused at the door, drawing Grace into his arms for a lingering kiss. "What was that for?" she asked when they finally parted, slightly breathless. "For being you," he replied simply. "For showing me what love really means, not just romantic love, but the kind that builds something lasting, the kind that makes a family." Grace reached up to touch his face, the familiar contours of his features as dear to her now as her own reflection. "When you found us that day and said you're coming home with me, I never imagined home would turn out to be so much more than just a place to live." Lucas captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Home is wherever we're together," he said. "That's all that matters." Hand in hand, they went inside to their sleeping children, closing the door on the vast Wyoming night, no longer harsh and threatening as it had once seemed to Grace, but beautiful and full of possibility, like the future stretching before them. In the years that followed, the Reed family would face their share of challenges: harsh winters, economic downturns, the ordinary trials of raising children in a frontier town. But the foundation they had built together proved strong enough to weather any storm. Their love, born in a moment of rescue and nurtured through daily acts of kindness and respect, continued to grow and deepen with each passing season. Sarah grew into a confident young woman with her mother's talent for teaching and her father's sense of justice. William followed in Lucas's footsteps, eventually becoming deputy sheriff before branching out to study law. And there would be other children: 2 twin girls born 3 years after William, and a surprise late-in-life son who arrived when Grace was 40. Lucas would serve as sheriff of Pine Ridge for nearly 2 decades, before retiring to focus on the small ranch they had gradually built outside town. Grace would educate generations of local children, leaving an indelible mark on the community that had once welcomed her as a desperate stranger. But no matter how full their lives became, no matter how far their family grew and changed, Lucas and Grace never forgot the providence of that fateful autumn day when a gunshot had drawn a lonely lawman to a desperate young mother's door, and 6 simple words had changed everything. "You're coming home with me," the cowboy said.